In the quiet stretch of Seward Highway south of Anchorage, Alaska, a chilling discovery in 1978 marked the beginning of a decades-long mystery when the body of 16-year-old Shelley Connolly was discovered. The case eventually went cold, leaving her friends and family without closure, until 2019, when forensic technology finally cracked the case wide open. Born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska, Shelley Connolly was a lively and spirited teenager with a penchant for adventure and a deep connection to her family. She was petite and often described as having an unassuming beauty. Her mother later noting that Shelley did not fully appreciate how attractive she was. Despite dropping out of high school, Shelley was eager to carve out her own path. She had a passion for beauty and personal care and was set to start cosmetology courses. At just 16, she was also engaged to a man in the military stationed at Fort Richardson. January 7, 1978, began like any other day in Anchorage, Alaska. The city was shrouded in a thick fog, and it would later become seared into the memories of those that knew Shelley, and a day that her mother, Judy Connolly, would replay countless times over the year. That evening, Shelley had plans to go out. She picked out an outfit that reflected her bold personality, and despite her mother's reservations about her going out dressed in revealing clothing, Shelley threw on a ski jacket her parents had given her for Christmas and made her way to Chilkoot Charlie's, a well-known Anchorage bar. Although underage, Shelley blended into the crowd of young adults who frequented the bar. During that time, it was a hotspot, the oil boom bringing in a surge of young men with disposable incomes. Shelley was seen leaving Chilkoot Charlie's later that night in the company of several men. Witnesses later reported seeing her at Leroy's, an all-night diner on C Street. But the timeline of her movements became increasingly murky. Sometime after leaving Leroy's, Shelley's fate took a tragic turn. The next morning, two female hikers were walking along the Seward Highway when something caught their eye down an embankment near the train tracks. What they initially thought might be discarded trash or debris turned out to be something far more horrifying. Lying motionless in the snow, they found the body of Shelley Connolly. Her petite frame was partially covered in the fresh snow. The girls immediately alerted the authorities, and soon the Alaska State Troopers were on the scene. They quickly secured the area as investigators from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation arrived. The state medical examiner would later determine that Shelley had suffered a brutal assault before being left in the frigid Alaskan winter. She had been beaten, and her body bore the signs of a vicious attack. Ultimately, it was a combination of internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen and exposure to the freezing temperatures that claimed her life. Evidence suggested that after she was assaulted, Shelley had been thrown from a moving car. Her hand became trapped in the door, and the vehicle dragged her some distance before her assailants realized what had happened. When they stopped the car and freed her, they callously discarded her over the side of the embankment, deserting her in the cold of the night. There were faint marks in the snow signs that she had tried to crawl up after being thrown out of the vehicle. Initial efforts focused on piecing together the events leading up to Shelley's tragic demise. Troopers interviewed witnesses, including patrons of Chilkoot Charlie's and Leroy's Diner, trying to trace her movements from the night before. Despite numerous interviews and efforts to reconstruct her last hours, the investigation hit a series of ends. The Alaska State Troopers quickly realized that the case would require more advanced forensic techniques. By 1997, with forensic DNA technology becoming a viable tool for solving cases, the Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory began developing a DNA profile from the biological evidence collected during Shelley's autopsy. This profile aimed to match the unidentified suspect's DNA with known profiles in CODIS. In 2003, the DNA profile from Shelley's case was uploaded into CODIS. Even with this step forward in the right direction, there was no match found, and the investigation remained at a standstill. The case was reopened and evidence re-examined multiple times throughout the years, yielding no new leads. It was not until 2019 that investigators finally got a break in the cold case. In early 2019, the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Unit turned to genetic genealogy for new insights. This innovative forensic technique involves submitting a DNA profile from the crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company specializing in DNA analysis and genealogy. Parabon Nanolabs compared the DNA profile from Shelley's case to profiles in public genealogical databases, such as GEDmatch. They identified a man named Donald F. McQuaid as a person of interest based on genetic connections to the DNA profile. The results indicated that McQuaid, who was 21 years old at the time of Shelley's slaying, was a likely suspect. Following this identification, Alaska State Troopers conducted a thorough investigation to confirm the link. They obtained a DNA sample from McQuaid and compared it with the evidence collected from Shelley's autopsy. The match was conclusive. DNA samples collected from 2 locations on Shelley's body matched McQuaid's DNA profile. The breakthrough led to McQuaid's arrest in September 2019. It was a pivotal moment in the case, bringing renewed hope to Shelley Connolly's family and the community. Shelley's mother, Judy, said that she felt many emotions when she was told that her daughter's perpetrator was finally found. She said, "Happiness that they found him. Sad too. 41 years, so this was totally unexpected." The evidence against McQuaid was compelling. The DNA match firmly linked him to the crime scene, and further investigation verified that he had been in Alaska in 1978, aligning with the timeline of the slaying. The legal proceedings that followed were intensive. McQuaid faced charges of first degree and second degree. The case was prosecuted by Assistant Attorneys General Aaron McCarthy and Paige Smothers, who worked diligently to present a thorough case to the court. The prosecution emphasized the severity of the crime and the profound impact on Shelley's family, seeking a sentence that reflected both the gravity of the offense and McQuaid's advanced age. On April 26, 2024, Superior Court Judge Andrew Peterson sentenced McQuaid to 50 years in prison for the slaying of Shelley Connolly. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Peterson underscored the seriousness of the crime and the long-awaited justice for Shelley and her family. He noted that while McQuaid had lived a full life and seen his children grow up, Shelley's family had been denied those years with her. The sentencing was an emotional moment for the Connolly family, who had waited over 4 decades for this resolution. They expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that while justice had been served, it could never fully compensate for the loss of Shelley. Shelley's mom, Judy, said, "Whatever the new technology is, I am just so glad that it came around and it solved this crime, and hopefully it will solve other crimes for different unsolved cases." In 1986, Ruby Doss was discovered strangled in Spokane's East Sprague area in Washington, leaving investigators with a cold case that seemed destined to remain unsolved. Over the years, the similarities between her case and a series of other unsolved slayings led to numerous false leads and ends. It appeared that justice for Ruby might never come, until a breakthrough in an unrelated crime unexpectedly brought new evidence to light, reigniting the search for her perpetrator. Ruby J. Doss was a 27-year-old woman living in Spokane, Washington in 1986. Originally from Detroit, Ruby had moved to Spokane seeking new opportunities and a fresh start. Before the crime that would take her life, Ruby had been struggling with various personal hardships, including economic difficulties. To make ends meet, she worked as an escort, a choice that placed her at increased risk in a world already fraught with danger. Despite these hardships, Ruby remained hopeful and resilient, trying to build a better future for herself and her children. Tragically, those dreams would never be fulfilled. On the rainy evening of January 30th, 1986, Ruby J. Doss's life came to a tragic end. Ruby was last seen in the East Sprague area of Spokane, a neighborhood known for its high levels of criminal activity and transient population. As the night wore on, the weather turned colder and wetter, adding to the bleakness of the evening. Ruby's final hours remain unclear, but it is known that she was found in a field near the intersection of Fisk and Ferry, an area that was both secluded and dimly lit. The discovery was made by a transient who stumbled upon her body. Ruby had been strangled, and the brutality of the crime was clear by the evidence left at the scene. Her body was found in a state that indicated a violent struggle. Police arrived at the scene to find Ruby's body, showing clear signs of trauma. The investigation quickly focused on the details surrounding her slaying, including the identification of potential witnesses and the collection of evidence from the crime scene. The evidence included fingerprints and DNA, although forensic technology at the time was limited. Initial interviews with potential witnesses and those familiar with Ruby did not bring any substantial leads, leaving investigators grasping for answers. As the investigation progressed, detectives noted troubling similarities between Ruby's case and a series of other unsolved slayings in the Spokane area. Over a span of months in 1986, several women, including Mary Ann Turner and Dorothy E. Burdett, were found strangled under circumstances that suggested a possible pattern. Mary Ann, a convicted prostitute, was found strangled next to a garage on South Ivory in early November. Dorothy, a 62-year-old woman with no known criminal background, was discovered in High Bridge Park on Christmas Day. The striking similarities in the method used to cut their lives short, particularly the use of strangulation, led investigators to consider whether a single perpetrator could be responsible for all these cases. Even with these connections, the investigation into Ruby's case faced significant obstacles. The conditions of that night, coupled with the sparse evidence and lack of immediate witnesses, made the investigation challenging. The forensic evidence collected was limited, and the technology of the time did not allow for comprehensive DNA analysis or provided definitive links between the cases. The police explored various theories, including the possibility of a serial perpetrator operating in the region, but were unable to find conclusive evidence to tie the cases together. The lack of significant progress and the absence of new leads gradually caused Ruby's case to grow cold. The investigation continued sporadically, but with each passing year, the chances of solving the case seemed to diminish. The breakthrough in Ruby Doss's case came more than 30 years after her brutal slaying, stemming from a seemingly unrelated investigation in a different state. By 2015, advancements in forensic technology had revolutionized the way law enforcement could analyze and match DNA evidence, providing new hope for cold cases. In a separate case, Richard Aguirre, then in his late 50s and a former police officer from Pasco, Washington, was under investigation for an assault that occurred in Franklin County. During this investigation, Aguirre's DNA was collected and entered into the National DNA Database, CODIS. In a stroke of luck, Aguirre's DNA profile was cross-referenced with DNA evidence collected from Ruby's crime scene. This pivotal match was made possible by advancements in DNA technology and the entry of evidence into the database, which had not been feasible at the time of the original investigation. The connection between Aguirre and Ruby's case was solidified when Spokane police obtained a search warrant for Aguirre's home. They collected new evidence, including items that could potentially link him to the crime. The renewed scrutiny and comparison of evidence confirmed that Aguirre was the prime suspect in Ruby's case. The discovery was a game changer. It not only identified the man responsible for Ruby's demise, but also rekindled hope for the families of other victims who had remained unsolved. After remaining unsolved for nearly 3 decades, Aguirre was arrested in June 2015 for his involvement in the slaying of Ruby Doss. The arrest was a major breakthrough for the Spokane police, who had long sought justice for Ruby and her family. Aguirre's trial began with intense scrutiny and high public interest. The prosecution presented a compelling case, highlighting the DNA evidence that linked Aguirre to the crime scene. But the trial was not without complications. The defense argued that Aguirre was not in Spokane at the time of the slaying, pointing to his military records and claiming that other DNA evidence found at the scene suggested multiple potential suspects. They contended that Aguirre's successful career as a police officer and his subsequent life should be considered in their defense. The trial took a turn when the jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict, resulting in a mistrial in early 2021. Aguirre's case was retried in 2023, and he chose to waive his right to a jury trial. He opted instead for a bench trial where Spokane County Superior Court Judge Jeremy Schmidt would decide his fate. The second trial concluded with Aguirre being found guilty of first degree on December 26, 2023. The verdict came as a relief to Ruby Doss's family, who had endured years of uncertainty and grief. On March 5, 2024, Richard Aguirre was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The sentence, handed down by Judge Schmidt. Schmidt noted the brutal nature of the crime and the enduring pain experienced by Ruby's family, acknowledging that no sentence could truly fill the void left by Ruby's loss. Aguirre's defense attorney argued for a reduced sentence, emphasizing Aguirre's age at the time of the crime and his later contributions to society. They also talked about the potential vulnerabilities Aguirre would face in prison, given his background as a former law enforcement officer. Ultimately, the judge decided on the maximum allowable sentence under the 1986 laws. The sentencing was a bittersweet closure for Ruby Doss's case. While it could not undo the past or fully heal the wounds left by her tragedy, it provided a measure of justice and a sense of resolution for her family. Lashunda Doss Walker, the oldest daughter of Ruby, said, "I am not sure how much he understands that he was such an eraser. He changed the trajectory of my life and my sister's lives in such a major way." Latoya Doss, another one of Ruby Doss' daughters, said, "This is not just a loss for me. It is a generational loss for my future family members." In the quiet town of Charlotte, Michigan, the tragic demise of Roberto Caraballo remained a mystery for over a decade until his charred remains were discovered in 2015. A crucial DNA breakthrough would reveal a shocking truth that would point fingers at the very people closest to him. Roberto Caraballo, a 37-year-old from Charlotte, Michigan, had a life full of both personal challenges and legal troubles before he tragically lost his life in 2002. Roberto had served time in federal prison, though the exact reasons for his incarceration are not widely documented. His life post-release was fraught with difficulties, including strained relationships and ongoing conflicts. He was married to Beverly McCallum. The couple's relationship was reportedly troubled with discord and personal strife. Roberto lived with Beverly and her daughter, Denian Ducharme, in a home on Horatio Street in Charlotte. In 2002, investigators found a metal footlocker with the remains of a human. The remains were extensively burned, making initial identification difficult. Despite the evidence of the brutal slaying, including the presence of a hammer, pieces of a wooden baseball bat, and remnants of a plastic bag and rope, authorities struggled to piece together the full story. Forensic teams collected physical evidence from the crime scene, but the investigation initially brought forward very few leads. The investigation continued for years, with detectives diligently following leads and exploring various theories. Even with the extensive work, the case remained unsolved, and the identity of the victim was not known until several years later. The breakthrough in the case came in 2015, more than a decade after the slaying. Denian Ducharme, who was serving a life sentence for first degree, reached out to authorities and provided crucial information implicating her mother, Beverly McCallum, and Christopher McMillan. This new information prompted a reinvestigation into the case. Advanced forensic techniques, including DNA analysis, were used to confirm the identity of Roberto and link the suspects to the crime. The information from Ducharme led to the identification of Roberto's remains and connected the suspects to the crime scene evidence. In May 2002, the basement of Roberto Caraballo's home in Charlotte, Michigan, became the scene of a brutal crime. He was lured into the basement by his wife and her daughter. Accompanied by Christopher McMillan, the group had planned the violent attack. Beverly pushed Roberto down the basement stairs, where her daughter struck him in the head with a hammer. Beverly then took over again, hitting Roberto repeatedly with the hammer until it became lodged in his head. Afterward, they suffocated him with a plastic bag and a rope. The body was then placed into a metal footlocker, driven to a remote location in Ottawa County, and set afire with gasoline. The remains were partially burned and left inside the locker, concealed in a blueberry field. In 2019, Christopher McMillan, a crucial figure in the case, was arrested and charged with second-degree and conspiracy to commit the slaying. McMillan, who had initially cooperated with authorities, provided pivotal testimony that implicated Beverly McCallum and Deneen Ducharme in the 2002 slaying of Roberto Caraballo. As part of a plea deal, McMillan pleaded guilty to his charges. His cooperation was essential in detailing the events of May 2002, including the brutal assault on Roberto and the subsequent disposal of his body. McMillan would eventually be sentenced to 15 to 40 years in prison. Beverly McCallum's arrest came a year later, in 2020, in Italy, where she had been living under the radar since the crime. She was extradited to Michigan in 2022. Despite McCallum's claims of innocence and her defense attorney's arguments that she was merely an accomplice, the jury found her guilty of second degree in April 2024. She was sentenced to 40 to 60 years in prison for the crime and an additional 10 to 15 years for disinterment and mutilation of a body. McCallum received credit for 1,500 days served, including her detention in Italy. Her sentencing concluded the long-running investigation, bringing a measure of justice to the case and closure for the victim's family. For decades, the search for Tommie Lee Hill seemed like a fruitless end. Convicted of heinous crimes spanning 3 states and vanishing from federal custody due to a clerical error, Hill remained elusive, until a single tip from a determined survivor changed everything. Tommie Lee Hill's criminal activities, which began in the 1960s, cast a long and dark shadow over the lives of his victims and the communities he touched. He committed some of the most atrocious crimes imaginable by assaulting children and was convicted of a string of crimes in Michigan and Indiana. His crimes even included assaulting his young stepdaughters and assault with intent to harm, burglary, firearms, and counterfeiting. One crime he committed was against his 12-year-old stepdaughter, Irma Shaw. He was sent from Terre Haute, Indiana jails to Grand Rapids to be sentenced for the crime, when during his sentencing, he told authorities he was thirsty. He entered the women's bathroom and escaped through a window into a getaway car. In 1979, Hill was convicted of serious crimes in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but his legal sentence was never served. On the same day he was to be sentenced, Hill managed a daring escape from custody due to a clerical error. He would go on to commit even more crimes in Pennsylvania. For years, Hill remained a fugitive, adopting new identities and locations to evade capture. A reward of $7,000 was offered for information through an anonymous tip site, but years went by with no leads, and the case went cold. At the heart of the case was Irma Shaw, a key figure in the pursuit of justice. Irma had been a victim of Hill's crimes, and she was driven by a deep sense of unresolved trauma and an unwavering commitment to see Hill held accountable. Her quest was not just about seeking justice for herself, but also about advocating for others affected by Hill's actions. Irma Shaw's pursuit of Hill took a turn in 2017 when an anonymous tip came in. A woman called saying she remembered seeing Hill with his car broken down on the side of the highway in Pittsburgh in the 1970s. This tip reignited the investigation, with leading officer Joe Garrett of the U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force re-examining the case. Garrett, working alongside Irma, employed genealogical evidence and investigative techniques to track Hill's new identity in Pennsylvania. Their investigation revealed, in June 2024, that Hill had been slain in 1983 by an individual seeking retribution for the harm Hill had inflicted. While this did not provide the opportunity for Hill to face justice in court, it offered a form of closure to those affected by his actions. Irma Shaw's tragic experience with Hill and her subsequent quest for justice shows the impact of trauma and the importance of perseverance. The case of Tommie Lee Hill is a powerful reminder of the dedication required to solve cold cases and the importance of justice, even when it comes many years after the fact.